Welcome to the New Monastics podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics podcast. I'm Nathaniel, co-founder of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, and one of your hosts.
And I'm Daniel, your other host for the show.
Today we have my dear friend Tessa Bielecki, a Carmelite Christian hermit and a pioneer in interfaith dialogue. In the 1980s, she participated in the seminal Buddhist-Christian dialogues convened by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. In the late 1960s, Tessa co-founded the Spiritual Life Institute, a Carmelite reform through which she founded 4 eremitical monasteries in North America and Ireland, and for which she served as Mother Abbess. Later, she left that position as abbess and, along with Father Dave Denny, founded the Desert Foundation, exploring connections between the Abrahamic faiths. Today, Tessa lives in Tucson, Arizona, where she considers herself an urban hermit.
Today, we'd like to try something a little different. Rather than dialoguing on a topic, we'd like to take the opportunity to conduct an interview, as Tessa has been living steeped in the space of contemplative life, new monasticism, and interspirituality for over 50 years, and we know there's much we can learn from her experiences and path. We're so happy to have you here, Tessa. To start us off, can you share with us a bit about yourself and your spiritual journey?
Well, thank you for having me. I didn't realize this was also going to be a podcast. That's wonderful. Where do I start? Let me just say I'm 77 years old in 2 weeks and happy about every single one of those years of my life. I represent officially, usually, generally, the Christian contemplative tradition. I come out of the Roman Catholic tradition, and I'll say more about that because I think there's a big difference between being born a Catholic and then what you have to do as an adult to appropriate that tradition on an adult level. Mm-hmm. And I was headed in the direction of international relations when I was both in grammar school and then in college. I majored in Russian and minored in French. I was very interested in the cultures and the peoples around the world. And I went into languages because I wanted to go into diplomacy, maybe work for the UN, or even be a linguistics professor because I love what languages say about peoples. And then it turned out that took a spiritual direction instead. And after college, I joined my original root teacher, William McNamara, who had started basically a new monastic community, although we never used that kind of language until I met Nathaniel and Adam Buchko and Rory McKenty and the other new monastics. But we really were creating a new monastic community. And we can talk about that too. Many of the aspects of what the direction that the new monastics go in, we were already doing as early as the 60s. And then, let me just say up front right away, it was a sexual misconduct scandal. And I left the community at that time. And with my friend, Father Dave Denny, who was also in the community, we created something called the Desert Foundation, a little nonprofit, very little. And we explore the wisdom of the desert and also try to build better understanding, reconciliation, and peace between the 3 Abrahamic traditions. And I when I left the community, I became even more of a hermit. We were what's called an eremitical community. In Christianity, there are 2 types of monasticism. One is cenobitical, which means that people live in community and focus on their community life. The other is the eremitical tradition, which is we live in separate hermitages, and solitude and silence are primary. And community is an overflow of that. So when I left my monastic community, I really became a hermit out in the middle of nowhere. And Nathaniel has spent time in my hermitage in Colorado, and Daniel, so have you. So you know what that is like to be out there in the middle of nowhere, under the stars, in that special kind of silence and solitude. But then in 2017, it was my 50th anniversary of joining formal contemplative life. And I really had a longing to move back to Arizona, which is where I originally started. And as I was aging, I felt the need both to be closer to healthcare, but also I wanted more culture. I had lived in the wilderness for 50 years, middle of nowhere for 50 years, often without running water and electricity. And I wanted more culture. So I moved to Tucson, Arizona, to an apartment, which I call my urban hermitage. And what is fascinating me is I really feel like I needed this experience for these last years of my life to put into practice in a situation in which most people live, all the lessons that I had learned all my life in the wilderness, and to show how it's possible to be contemplative in an urban apartment in a bustling city. I'm also in love with St. Teresa of Avila and have done a lot of writing with St. Teresa of Avila. And one of the greatest expansions of my life is the interspiritual dialogue that I've done since the early 1980s. So that's a bit of an overview to get us started.
Thank you. I would actually like to just go back to the beginning of that story. I had something that I wanted to ask you about in terms of that move when you thought you were going to, I read somewhere that you thought you were going to the UN with the international relations degree. And you said somewhere that in that process of kind of discerning if you were going to go to the UN, you were sort of ambushed by Christ, is the words that you used. And I'm curious if you can share with us a little bit that experience or that process and what that felt like and how it really drove you to engage with the Christian contemplative tradition.
Yes, I'd love to do that. I love how we call ourselves Christians. And that wasn't always the case. Originally, the people who followed Jesus were called the followers of the way. We weren't called Christians. I love that we are. And I was what you call a Cradle Catholic. I was born into the tradition. I loved growing up Catholic. I have no horror stories to tell. And I think that's for several reasons. One, I never went to Catholic schools until I chose to go to a Catholic college where I had just incredible grounding in the intellectual foundations of what it means to be Catholic. Just tremendous, exciting theology that really lit my life on fire. And I think what happens is when you're born into a tradition, you reach a point where you have to choose it. You have to choose it as an adult, which is what I did. I chose it because it excited me. The other reason I think I don't have any negativity about my upbringing is that I was born into a Polish American family, and we were very, we were really indigenous. We were very linked to the earth. We had all these ceremonies and rituals that my more Anglo friends didn't do in their Catholicism. We ate special foods at special times. And for example, on Christmas Eve, we put straw under the tablecloth to honor the manger in which Jesus was born. And we didn't start any festivities until the first star came out. And it was always my job and my family to put that straw onto the tablecloth and look for the star. So there was this grounding in the earth and in the seasons of the year. And for me, that was just very, very rich. And then in college, I got this very, very solid theological training. And it was at the time of Vatican II. You may not know what that was, but the Catholic Church was just so stuck and had been stuck for centuries. And in 1962, Pope John the 23rd called the Second Vatican Council, and the metaphor was he was throwing open the windows of the church and sweeping out the cobwebs. And that really happened in very radical ways. Lots and lots of things changed and changed for the better. And theologically, it was a very exciting time. And I was not only reading these cutting edge theologians like Karl Rahner and Hans Kung and Teilhard de Chardin, but some of these people I actually heard speak in that era. So I was all fired up in that way. And then it's hard to describe what happened. I guess I'll put it this way. I wanted to do something. I wanted my course of studies to go in a certain direction. And a kind of tough old nun in my college, which was Trinity College in Washington, D.C., now it's Trinity Washington University, she wouldn't let me do what I wanted. I had been majoring in Russian, and because I had this awakening, I wanted to major in theology. There wasn't a major at Trinity. I concocted this whole plan for how I could do it, and she wouldn't let me. And this was such a crisis. It kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I think that's often the case, that there's some kind of crisis situation that really shakes up the whole direction that we're going in. And whether it's an illness, it could be the death of someone we love, it could be some tremendous disillusionment. It could be a major obstacle like this, where how I wanted my life to go was obstructed. And somehow in that, because I was no longer in control, this is what's important, I was no longer in control. And so Christ somehow broke through, and I was no longer in charge of my life. I had a sense of being led and directed. And it was extremely intense. I guess the best way to describe it is that I really fell in love with Christ at that point, that I had always been very dutiful. And suddenly it wasn't a question of duty any longer. I was just in love and on fire with the life of Christ and excited about who Jesus was and what this path would mean. And then it was while I was in this, the beginnings of this is when William McNamara came to give a retreat. And, well, we can, if you might have a particular question about that, but I realized that the direction I really wanted to go in was this. Well, it wasn't that I wanted to be contemplative or wanted to be a monk. This is important. At that time, I was kind of struggling with what I thought was a dichotomy between holiness and vitality. And I thought I had to choose one or the other. I didn't think they could go together. My mistake, but I just didn't think that they could go together. And when I met this person, I saw the embodiment of both, and I realized that they could be integrated. So what attracted me was that integration of the word I used at the time was holiness, but I think I probably meant the contemplative path and deep immersion in life, a tremendous zest for life, which I believe is the start of the contemplative path. Zest for life.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about who Father William was at that time that made such an impact? What was he like?
He was probably the most vibrant and charismatic person I had ever met. You know, when you read the Gospels, more than once, when people are listening to Jesus, they say, oh, no one ever spoke like this man. And that's how I felt listening to Father William. He was extremely deep. He was very funny. And he didn't talk like anyone else. So yes, he would quote the saints like John of the Cross and Saint Teresa, but he also talked about Dostoevsky and Nikos Kazantzakis and E.E. Cummings and J.D. Salinger. And he brought everything in. He brought in psychology. He brought in science. He was broad, just a big thinker. He actually was, when he started this community of ours, the Spiritual Life Institute, he was very in touch with Michael Murphy at Esalen Institute. And in fact, both Esalen and the Spiritual Life Institute were beginning at the same time. And Father William hung out a lot with Mike Murphy. I got to hang out a lot with Mike Murphy once I joined. Mike came and spoke at 2 of our big anniversaries. We used to visit him in San Francisco. So there was this tremendous exchange of ideas. And he was already interspiritual. So, for example, when we finally got a chapel built, there really wasn't anything like that when I first joined. And we designed our prayer. Yes, we used the divine office and recited the Psalms morning and evening like most monastics do. But we created our own book of readings, and we were quoting Sufis and Zen stories. And there were just meditations from a wide range of the spiritual traditions of the world. And this is early 60s. Even before Vatican II, Father William had this vision. So he was extremely visionary. It's a great tragedy that he messed up, and that some people have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Personally, I still hold to his teachings. They were extremely exciting and dynamic, and there was really nobody like him. So it's a great loss what happened to him. But it's happened to so many teachers and so many spiritual traditions, and I think it's important to see beyond the failings and the faults of an individual and cling to the good teachings that came from those people. I know Brother David Steindl-Rast once said to me about one of the Buddhist teachers, rusty pipes still give water. And I think that's very true.
Once you met Father William and he had started the Spiritual Life Institute, and that you joined the Spiritual Life Institute soon after meeting William, it sounds like. I'm curious, sounds like there you found this resolution of what you were calling the dichotomy between holiness and vitality, and that you found that there was some kind of synthesis that brought both holiness and vitality to you, and it sounds like in a lot of ways to the community. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to that. And also, when you're speaking about meeting Father William, it sounds like part of that transformation for you that was leading you to want a deeper engagement was also a kind of particular vision and experience of Christ that I'd love for if you could share a little bit about. I think in just a little bit of exposure I've had to your teachings, the portrait of Jesus that you paint and sounds like the living reality that is core to your experience is very different than a lot of the ways in which you'll normally hear Jesus spoken about. For instance, you call Jesus both wild and playful. And so I'm curious if you can just kind of explain how that synthesized, basically, to sum it up, just how that vision of Christ played out in the community life of the Spiritual Life Institute, and just a little bit about how that impacted you. I know it was four decades of work, so not easy to summarize, but if you could attempt a summarization, that would be wonderful.
Okay. That was a lot, and I forgot what you said at the beginning, but I think the basis of my life and of what we were trying to do as a community is, again, the new monastic direction is very much this. What we were living out is that there is no dichotomy between the so-called spiritual life and life. There's only one life. And everything we do is spiritual if we have that right perspective. So what we did was immerse ourselves in life. In fact, one of the major teachings we had was that if we immerse ourselves in life, in whatever life brings our way, good or bad, work or play, tragedy or comedy, whatever, if we're fully immersed in life, prayer will inevitably erupt. And Christians speak more about prayer than meditation, because and prayer is not I don't like to call it a practice. I don't like that word practice, but I've been I wouldn't say forced, because I've done it gladly, but it's a word that I learned in interspiritual dialogue, because as Christians, we don't normally talk about practice. We would more likely talk about devotions. And the major practice is prayer. But that's not always easy to talk about, especially if you're dialoguing with Buddhists who aren't theistic the way Christians are. But my point is immersion in life. So if you ask me the most important teaching of Jesus, I would say, and this is the only scriptural passage I can quote with numbers, because I'm a Catholic and not a Protestant. Protestants are much better at that. But it's John 10:10, easy to remember, where Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. That to me is the essence of Christianity. And somehow that all got warped very early on in our tradition. And Christianity became life-denying. And that's not what you see in the life of Jesus. You see tremendous vitality. He's relating to all kinds of people. The tax collectors who were the lowest of the low in his age, the prostitutes, children. They tried to keep children away from him, and he says, no, bring the children. His first miracle is turning water into wine. He was called a drunkard and a glutton. Now, what did people see him doing that they could call him a drunkard and a glutton? They must have seen him enjoying himself, eating and drinking. This is the Jesus I see in the Gospels. I also see, I love all the passages that talk about his weeping. He's so in love with his friend Lazarus, and he learns that Lazarus has died, and he weeps because he feels sorrow. Jesus was not a stoic, and Christianity it's not about stoicism. It's not about the denial of life and vitality. It's exactly the opposite. It's about deep feeling, which is what we see throughout the life of Jesus. It's about living and living passionately, which is what we also see in the life of Jesus. I don't know if that answers if there's something more specific, but that's what I see. Life, life, life. So that our community life, our contemplative life, was full of creativity. We made music, we did skits, we worked hard, we built buildings, we grew gardens, every aspect of life that you can imagine, we were immersed in, and it was life-affirming, not life-denying. And I think that that's the tragedy of Christianity, that certainly in the Roman Catholic tradition, it became, extremely life-denying. But then think of Puritanism. That's Christianity, but that is not gospel, and that is not the life of Jesus. It's quite the opposite.
But it sounds like the particularities of your community were more life-affirming and potentially more life-giving than a lot of traditional monastic environments. As you were saying, early on in Christianity, it took this kind of life-denying turn. And so I'm wondering if you can highlight for us, what are some of those differences between the communities that you've been a part of and more traditional monastic communities or older monastic communities?
Yeah, I think let's start with what would have been most obvious. We were both men and women, whereas traditional religious life would be either all men or all women. See, I wouldn't have been caught dead in that kind of community. Part of what attracted me was the man-woman thing. And I think part of that traditionally was fear of man-woman relationships, fear of women in all male communities. For example, we women didn't cut our hair. We had long hair. I have short hair now because I swim every day. But as a monk, I had long hair down to my waist. And we had this understanding that the cutting of women's hair, that was all part of the fear of women and denying the reality of women, that they had to they had to cut their hair, they had to hide their hair. And we didn't do that. The fact that we had so much fun, that we wrote music, we wrote poetry, we believed in the arts. We were very big Tolkien fans, for example, and we were so immersed in The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings was actually a metaphor for our monastic life. We were on a quest. We were on an adventure. We were a fellowship. We were a company. And we derived tremendous inspiration from those books. We each chose a character, and we went on quests. We created these incredible quests, and one of our company wrote like 30 songs based on Lord of the Rings, and we would sing these songs, The White Rider and Hey Ho for the Bath at the End of the Day, and one about Theoden, and it was just tremendous. We made a sword. We all created a coat of arms for ourselves, a shield that embodied our monastic vocation. Mine was a harp and a bow. And I don't know if you remember, but there's a scene at the very beginning of Fellowship of the Ring where Frodo and the Fellowship goes to Rivendell, and they meet Haldir the elf. And Haldir says to them, alas, for these times, our hands are more often on the bow than the harp. And that meant a lot to me, because as a leader in the community, I had tremendous responsibilities and tremendous burdens. And, and it was difficult, very often extremely difficult. And I really felt in those days that my hands were too much on the bow and not on the harp. Now it's exactly the opposite. Since I left monastic life, now my hands are more often on the harp than the bow, and that's a big, big plus. So I almost was going to change my coat of arms, and then I realized, no, it still stands, but it's reversed. Whereas before it was more work, build buildings, build community, build a garden, just too much work, I will say. And now that I'm this age and living on my own, it's much more the opposite. There's more music, there's more creativity, there's more leisure. So those are some of but you wouldn't have seen that kind of first immersion in a so-called secular literature. Traditional communities, oh my gosh, I would die if all I was exposed to was the Bible. There's just, yes, that's important. But you can really get stuck there. And we were immersed in a much broader world of inspiration, believing that all of this was revelation. Poetry is revelation. Music is revelation. I think Motown is terrific, and there's a lot of wisdom in Motown music. I'm dating myself by saying that that's my favorite music, but it is. So that's just it was a very rich life. And see, again, new monasticism is about being immersed in the world. And so we, in the world, but not of it, is the way the Gospels speak of it. And so we were very much in the world, whereas traditional monasticism would be pulling back from the world. We weren't afraid of it because it was all suffused with the Holy Spirit. And that isn't how Christianity lost that vision. And monasticism especially. I'll go so far as to say this, even though I was living apart in a monastic community, I often said, I think monasticism is antithetical to the gospel because Jesus didn't separate himself except for special times when he would retreat into silence and solitude to get perspective and refuel. Otherwise, he was immersed in the world. So I think that's a strength. I feel as though the community that I helped create, I feel like we were a bridge between traditional Christian monasticism and what the new monastics are trying to do in the world. We went way beyond traditional monasticism, but not as far as I think the new monastic movement is going. But we had some of the best of the tradition, and we were beginning to show that a new way was needed. We were already embodying that, and I think it was partly paving the way for what is now happening.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the transition from going from college student to the full eremitical life and really becoming a foundress of a community. And I believe in the beginning it was just you and Father William maybe out in the desert. Can you just talk about that transition and what that was like for you as maybe a 20-year-old young woman?
Yeah. And actually there were three of us because very early on, a college dropout by the name of David Samuel Levin, who was Jewish, came to live with us. So we were a threesome. And I'm happy to say he lives only an hour and a half from me here in Tucson. So we have been having a great deal of fun pulling out photos. I have, 4,000 photos of all of this. And he and I just look at these photos from way back in the late 60s and just go into gales of laughter over, how young we were, how naive we were. So what was that transition? I didn't go to be a monk because there was no form yet. People who joined us later joined us to become monks, or they joined a monastery. I didn't. I went to follow a charismatic teacher who embodied how I wanted to live. I was only beginning to learn what contemplation was. I was only beginning to learn what it meant to be a Carmelite. I didn't know much of this. Although I think I had, let me say this. One of Father William's most important teachings was this, that the contemplative or the mystic, and those words are interchangeable, is not a special kind of person, but everyone is or can become a special kind of contemplative, a special kind of mystic. So I didn't know what kind I was. I didn't know what it meant to be contemplative. And maybe we should talk about what we mean by that. I think an awful lot of people think it means being quiet, and they relate it too much to being quiet. And I think that's a mistake because it isn't always quiet. It can be wildly joyful. It can be extremely painful. And I think what we mean by contemplation is, my description of it would be, and this is going to be theistic, loving experiential awareness of God. This is an experience. This is experiencing God. Now, if you don't believe in God, what is it experiencing? I can't speak to that. For me, it's experiencing God. It's experiencing personal, passionate presence. Now Buddhists talk about mindfulness. Mindfulness is such a big word today. Mindfulness is okay, but I prefer personal, passionate presence. I think it's a lot juicier. It emphasizes an awareness of presence. That presence is personal, not a person, but personal, accessible to me, and is passionate. And so my response to personal passionate presence with a P, which is my favorite description of God, is my own small p personal passionate presence. So I think that's what contemplation is about, is a loving experiential awareness of that presence and my response to that presence. Maybe that's falling silent and being quiet, as in centering prayer or simply sitting and being in the presence. It might be singing. St. Augustine said, the one who sings prays twice. It could be dancing. It could be laughing, just an explosion of joy. I experience God a lot cooking and eating good food, drinking tequila. All of this is part of the contemplative life. It's not separate. And I can't emphasize that enough.
If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening.
So transition, let me see, I got carried away there. That's my community used to say, we played this game where we would title each other's biographies, and mine was, she got carried away. So you do need a certain amount of silence and solitude, especially at the beginning. Well, I shouldn't say especially at the beginning, because I hunger for it now more than ever, because silence and solitude is time with the beloved. But when I first went, I didn't have any experience of that, because I'm, as you can probably tell, an extrovert. So we began to have solitude like a quiet hour every day. And then that expanded to a day every week. And then as we grew into this life, it became a week every month. And at special times of the year, like Lent before Easter and Advent before Christmas, we had 2 weeks of solitude. And I still do that. My rhythm here is 3 days of solitude a week. And then on the other days, I engage with people and do other kinds of work. And in terms of becoming Foundress, well, first of all, I got there first. I was the first person to join Father William permanently, and I didn't realize it, but I had a lot of gifts that I didn't even know I had. If you've done the Myers-Briggs tests, I'm a J, so I know how to organize, I know how to set up structures, and I love doing that. I love setting up a system. If you need me to set up a system, I'm just happy as can be. I love setting things up. It's fun for me. And so what happened to us is we would keep buying these, moving to these rundown places. Like the first one was an old ranch. The second one was an old hunting and fishing lodge. You walk into chaos, and what do? Well, I knew what to do, and I knew what to do in an instant. It's not like I have to work at this. It's like, and so I realized I had those gifts. I knew how to organize a liturgy or set up a scrapbook and what happened is, so Father Wim was this big visionary. It was all this, in some sense, it was abstract. And then I would say, yeah, but how do you embody that? How do you live that out on a daily basis? I think women are especially good at that. You know, physically, women give birth. And I live as a celibate. I have never had a child, but my life has been constant generativity. There's been constant giving birth in all kinds of ways. And that's what we do. I think women give a body to vision. And that was my role, but it was very natural and spontaneous. It just sort of unfolded. That was part of the beauty of being part of something brand new and starting with it was just so amorphous. And it was so exciting to make form out of chaos. Very, very. And I'm still doing it. It's just my nature. It's is your house a mess? Well, I can come in and tell you how to organize. I just love that, and I think that's the primordial act of God. As we read in the beginning of the Jewish scriptures, God created out of what? Out of chaos. I mean, that's the Judeo-Christian metaphor. Whether it's the Big Bang or what, it doesn't matter. Order comes out of chaos. I call it, somehow God is at the root of all of this, is at the root of my gift, that this is a God-given gift. And so eventually we started calling me Foundress. I wasn't called that at first. I was just the cook. I was the gardener. I was the secretary. I answered the phone. We also were a retreat center. I forgot to say that. So it's not just our own community, but we're welcoming people from all walks of life and from all traditions who had a hunger for silence and solitude. And so every retreatant lived in a hermitage just like we did. And that's why people came to us, because they wanted that silence and that solitude.
And you mentioned in passing that you're a Carmelite. And I would like for you just to explain. I myself don't have a great grasp of what exactly that means as distinguished from other Catholic traditions.
Oh, I just love how rich our tradition is, how diversified it is. So most people have heard of Franciscans who follow St. Francis. So their name derives from a person. Or Benedictines who follow St. Benedict, and they're the great. Benedict is considered the father of Western monasticism. He's the one who started that whole thing. But the wonderful thing about Carmelites is that we're not named after a person. We're named after a mountain. Mount Carmel it's outside of Haifa in present-day Israel. And the first Carmelites lived on Mount Carmel, and that's why they were called Carmelite. I just love that we're named after a big hunk of rock and not a person. So to me, that's part of the earthiness of the tradition. And what happened is we think that the first Carmelites were originally crusaders, very dark part of Christian history, for which most of us repent. Some don't, and that's a problem. And I like to say that those first Carmelites traded one kind of sword for what we could call the sword of the spirit, or spiritual warfare, which is battling against our own egotism. And so these original men, probably ex-crusaders, began to live as hermits on the slopes of Mount Carmel, and were there for about 100 years. And then because of the ongoing struggles between Christians and Muslims, they were driven off Mount Carmel and moved into Europe. And they had originally been hermits, but then they became, they moved into big buildings. They became big communities instead of individual hermits. And when St. Teresa, so those first Carmelites, the first in time we know of them is 12th century. St. Teresa comes along in the 16th century, and she's living in this huge, noisy, busy convent that's not very spiritual. A lot of women at that time went into the convent, first of all, to avoid marriage. And it wasn't very spiritual. And Teresa had, she had a hunger for silence and solitude and for a deeper kind of prayer. And so, well, it's a big, exciting story because she was very sneaky and the whole thing was very secretive and she was subversive and revolutionary, and she kind of escaped and founded this first convent of hers. And there were rules of separation from people. And if you went to visit those nuns at the beginning, for example, they wore veils when you talked to them. Part of the reason for that was to create the silence and solitude. They would be living in a big building together. Well, not a big building, because one of her points was that the community should be no larger than 12. Magic number, because that's the number of disciples that Jesus chose, whereas Teresa had come from a big convent of 100. And but some of those original rules, which I find a little bit spooky, but the point of them was to create more silence and solitude for the contemplative life. So the focus is on contemplative life. Our educators, Jesuits are educators, some are serving in hospitals, but for Carmelites, the focus was always the contemplative life. And then John of the Cross and Teresa wrote a lot about what that means, and they're great teachers of the contemplative life.
And so I know you've written numerous books and taught courses on St. Teresa of Avila. So I'm curious, for you, what is special about Teresa? What speaks especially to your heart, or what qualities or teachings have really animated your spiritual life? It does seem, just from the outside, that there's a particular affinity or attraction for you there to her as a figure in particular. And I'm wondering if you can just share with us what that is, and maybe with a specific emphasis on what about her do you think is generally applicable or potentially inspiring for spiritual practitioners generally in today, whether they're Catholic or not?
Oh, yeah. I think she's a model for everybody. So what attracted me to her at first was the fact that she was this revolutionary leader, and she was the foundress. So we talked about the Carmelites. Well, when Teresa started, her way of life was so different. She was actually creating a new kind of Carmelite, so that the Carmelite order split at the time of Teresa. And it doesn't matter to you what they're called, but one side of the Carmelites that she had come out of was the more active kind of Carmelite, and Teresa's kind of Carmelite, which are called, well, I'll tell you, they're called discalced. That just means they didn't wear shoes; they wore sandals. That's just what they became known as. But they were the contemplatives. But what struck me at first was that she was this powerful woman at a time when women were not powerful and out in the world doing things. And because I was a foundress, and I built 4 different monastic retreat centers in my decades in the Spiritual Life Institute, and she did I forget if it's 13 or 15 in as many years. And so just learning from her about how she coped, she was both very strong, because imagine she's starting this thing. She's living in a world of men. She also has the distinction. She didn't just start convents for women. She started monasteries for men. So in the Roman Catholic tradition, she has the distinction of being the only woman who ever reformed an order of men. So, wow, what kind of a witness is this? And we're talking not only 16th century, but 16th century Spain, which was particularly repressive. This is the time of the Inquisition. This is the time of the conquistadors. Her brothers were conquistadors. Sad to say, some of her convents were built by money that her brother earned as a conquistador in South America. So there's that power in her, that strength in her. And I think women today can benefit tremendously from her example, just as a leader. And at the same time, she had tremendous vulnerability. So when you read her, and I identified with this as well, she would be frightened. She'd be full of doubts. She'd be sad. She also was, she really believed in friendship, the importance of friendship and support on the path. Now, this traditionally has not been a part of the Christian path, especially the monastic path, which again is crazy because you look at Jesus and all his friendships in the Gospels. Teresa had a tremendous number of friends. We only have 400 of her letters left, but that's a lot. And in those 400 letters, she refers to 800 other people. So imagine that number of people that are part of her circle. So she really stands out for that as well. And then, and this would not have been what first attracted me to her, but I grew into this. She is what we call, in the Christian mystical tradition, we call her a bridal mystic. She's part of the tradition of bridal mysticism or spousal mysticism, which means, yes, God is God, God is Lord. We use that language. I personally love that language. And I must remember to relate that to Lord of the Rings again, and the king and serving the king. But for Teresa, ultimately, God was spouse. So that the relationship is extremely intimate. Her description of prayer is an intimate encounter with the one we know loves us. And I guess I want to tell a story that conveys her relationship. So in order to found all these different monasteries, she would travel the highways and byways of Spain in a rickety mule-driven cart. And there were a lot of mishaps with these carts. And at one point, the cart has gotten stuck in the mud, tips over, and Teresa falls in the mud. And the story goes that God said to her, well, Teresa, this is the way I treat my friends. And Teresa's response was, well, no wonder you have so few. And now that's an example of prayer. She's having an intimate encounter with the one she knows loves her. But it isn't this, look what it is. She's angry. She's expressing chagrin. That's prayer. That's another example of prayer. It's not just, oh, I love you. Yes, there's all that. But here she is being angry and giving God a piece of her mind about how unhappy she is and why. So that's that dimension of bridal mysticism or spousal mysticism. As I grew in my contemplative life, that just grew stronger and stronger. So that's another reason I love her, because she's very articulate about that kind of relationship to God, that kind of contemplation. Let me just say something about language. Part of the reason I loved Lord of the Rings, well, I grew up loving, the first movie I ever saw was Robin Hood. The second one was Ivanhoe. So like I'm 8 years old or something. And both Robin Hood and Ivanhoe are trying to ransom King Richard of England, who was captured during the Crusades. And something about that knight archetype, I couldn't have said this at the time, but of course, as I age and I look back on how did I get here and what were the influences on me? Movies were very important, especially movies about chivalry. And that posture of the knight serving the king, kneeling before the king, went very deep in me and awakened a part of myself that's very, very strong. So for me to call God king is not a problem. Personally, I do not have any experience of God as mother. I can't speak to that. that's not my path. I really appreciate that in so many people I know. I don't know that by experience. I only know it up here. My experience would be much more this chivalric thing of serving my king, loving my king, laying down my life for my king. And so when we did Lord of the Rings and we chose our characters, I chose Faramir, if you know Lord of the Rings, because Faramir lived a hidden life in the forest serving the king. And he's my favorite character. And that's how I saw my life as a hermit. I was, yes, I had a very public life, but the heart of my life was being hidden away, loving and serving the king and making it possible for the king to return, to come into the world, to come into being. So that's why I loved Faramir. And Teresa's writings are very full of chivalric language. So I really vibrate to that. That's not everybody's way, but it's extremely strong, very strong in me.
I'm so happy that you got to tell us your Lord of the Rings character. You teased it for us earlier, and I was waiting for it. So
Yeah.
I would have been very disappointed if we didn't find out. Tessa Bielecki, aka Faramir.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm wondering if you can just speak. So you said that you love this language of mother in other traditions and other people, and so I just like to take this as a jumping off opportunity for you to share a little bit about your experience with interreligious dialogue and interspirituality. As you were saying, even at the Spiritual Life Institute, it was an environment in which readings and inspiration from other wisdom traditions was welcome. And so I'm just curious, you said that, for instance, mother is not relatable from your experience, God as mother. But when you speak with somebody who that is their theology, how does it impact you? As just one example.
Yeah. I think, people will ask, well, why is it important to be interspiritual? What's the value of it? I also love, by the way, Beverly Lanzetta's, one of her recent books, she uses the term intercontemplative. And I prefer that. So I was really thrust into, we used to call it interreligious dialogue. I was at the first Buddhist-Christian dialogue at Naropa University. And I know a lot of Naropa students will see this or hear this. I have a very special place in my heart for Naropa because it was, I will say, a crucible in which I was put in the fire and out of which I really grew, and a lot of gold came out of that crucible. When people ask, what's the value of it or why is it important? I want to say, why isn't it? I think the question should be reversed. Why aren't we doing it? Why wouldn't it be important? And I've just been thinking lately, we travel to each other's countries, we eat each other's food, we learn each other's languages. Why wouldn't we be sharing each other's spiritual practices? It's not for me to say why this is important. It's for somebody else to say why this isn't. Because to me, it just seems like the most obvious thing in the world. And when I first went to that my first experience was, I will say, terrifying. One of the first things I saw as I walked into what was the shrine room at Naropa at that time, one of the first things I saw was Kali, a shrine to Kali in the corner with all those skulls and that fierce face. And it was like, whoa, what is this? So I have to say, I was scared to death. And I didn't know anything about Buddhism. And I'm going to go so far as to say, at that time, I didn't even like Buddhism. And I only was there because Father William, who had been invited, got sick and couldn't go. And so I went instead. And I was the only woman for those first years in that dialogue, which was extremely difficult. I was not only the youngest, I was the only woman. And what was interesting was, I don't know, maybe was it around the third year of it? I had a great encounter with Joseph Goldstein from the Insight Meditation Center, which was extremely helpful for all of us. He said, you know what? I think the struggles you are having are not Christian Buddhist struggles. They're man-woman struggles. And he said, the same things that you are saying, the same things you're challenging us men, he says, I get that from the women in my own community. And not only as a woman, but as the personality that I am, I was very forthcoming about feelings, about experiences. And initially the men were not. They were kind of heady. And so I think it's very important to have men and women in dialogue with one another, because because women are more embodied, women so in touch with feelings, so ready to convey those feelings. I think that's extremely important. I think the major value of interspiritual relations or intercontemplative relations is the expansion that happens. I could actually, it was almost a visceral experience for me. I could feel my heart just opening as I was confronted with the challenges of otherness, what seemed to be otherness. And I think two important things. I think you start out, my first experience was, whoa, we're so different. And then the deeper you go, or the more time you have, it's, oh gosh, there are all these similarities. And first, oh, we're so different is scary. Then it's, oh, look at all these confluences. Look at all these similarities. That's great. But I think the third step is, whoa, we are so different. And isn't that great? And I think that takes a lot of experience. I think that takes a lot of love for your own tradition, that you can see all these differences, be challenged by the differences, and love those differences and say, but I'm not that. I'm this. And that's where I think we need to end up. The other thing I want to say about it is another crucial lesson, and I got this from Ramon Panikkar, who's very important to the new monastics, and who was the Roman Catholic pioneer in interspiritual dialogue. Not just Roman Catholic. I mean, he was one of the great pioneers, period. And what he said is, when we go into dialogue, first of all, he emphasized the fact that it's important to be not only grounded in your tradition, but really secure and loving your tradition. But that what happens is you go into it being vulnerable to conversion. And what he meant by that is, so I go to Naropa, I go vulnerable to conversion, and I did go like that, scared, but vulnerable to conversion. What he meant was, I convert to a different kind of Christianity because of my encounter with Buddhism. And hopefully Buddhists become, and this was not my experience, that Buddhists become better Buddhists as a result of their dialogue with Christianity. Unfortunately, at the beginning, there was a lot of what I would call reverse triumphalism. Part of the difficulty in dialogue is that my experience was that an awful lot of, let's just stick with this one particular instance, in those Naropa dialogues, people had left Christianity and were angry at Christianity, disaffected by it, and then took on Buddhism without having done their work to come to terms with their Christianity and their disaffection. And that complicated things, because they were reacting against their experience. not what Christianity is. And the other really big problem was that people had left Christianity at a very early age. Let's just call it the Sunday school age. Then they're immersed in very sophisticated contemplative Buddhism, and they're comparing their Sunday school Christianity with their sophisticated contemplative Buddhism, not knowing that there was this whole deep contemplative Christian tradition, which unfortunately has been buried in Christianity. And part of the value of what's happened in dialogue is that Christians have had to look at that tradition and bring that hidden treasure out of hiding in order to put it in dialogue, so that then you're dialoguing on more of an equal footing. But for me, the initial experience was not equal. I will also say, because people hadn't taken care of their unfinished business, I was kind of not only a trigger, but a target for a lot of unresolved stuff. So one of the great values for me was, because my experience of Christianity had been so positive, this was a huge awakening for me about all the damage that had been done to people. And so a lot of my work was healing wounds in the former Christians by presenting a different way. And I'll never forget one of those first dialogues. Somebody stood up and said, "Well, you sound like a heretic. This isn't what you're talking about, isn't Christianity." And I said, "Oh, yes, it is." And I was feeling kind of frisky at that point. And Thomas Keating was there. David Snodgrass was there. We had a very strict Russian Orthodox priest, Thomas Hopko, there. And I said, "Well, let's have a heresy trial here." And, I called on the big guns, the big male guns. And I said, "Well, am I a heretic or am I not?" And it was just fun because they all stood up, and exonerated me. She is Orthodox. She is Orthodox. She is Orthodox. But people didn't know that. People didn't know about everything I've been saying to you. So I feel like I went through the fire in those dialogues, especially in the early years, especially as the only woman. And it has been so rich for me. As I said, I just broke wide open. I learned to appreciate wounds that people have from spiritual traditions. I learned new language. For example, I learned how to express myself in more universal ways, although that was kind of always our orientation, in my training. It already was that. For example, the understanding of shunyata has become extremely important to me. I would not have known that unless I'd been in dialogue with Buddhists. And it's become my understanding of why I love the desert so much. Understanding that shunyata is spaciousness. And when I look out on the desert, what do I see? I see that spaciousness outside, which is what I aspire to embody on the inside. That kind of openness, that kind of spaciousness, that kind of capacity, that kind of potential.
I'm just reflecting that, you started your response by saying, why be interspiritual? Like, people ask this question, why be interspiritual? And your response is, why not be? That it should be more the natural thing. And I'm reflecting from my position. I'm a former Naropa student myself, and, been in contact with all kinds of new agey things. And I would say, at least from my perspective, more people have the question, why be dedicated to a tradition? Is almost more of the challenge, and for a lot of modern spiritual seekers, than why be interspiritual. Like, there is that bias towards, oh, well, everything is one. Wisdom can come in many forms. We can kind of create an appetizer platter of things. And that is, the most diverse and beautiful way to go about it. So just as we kind of come to a close, you shared beautifully about the interspirituality, but I'm actually curious for you to share the other side, having both experiences, right? Like a rich interspirituality and contact with other traditions, but also very much rooted in your own deep well. What do you see as the value in both sides? And obviously you have your own particular experience is more of being rooted in a tradition. So I'd like for you to speak to that. But I'm also curious about your reflections looking from the outside on maybe people who have a deep spiritual longing and are walking some kind of spiritual path, but don't have the same kind of dedication to a established tradition.
I think that's an important question. I think it's a very challenging question. I'm still working with that question. I think people who haven't been raised, rooted in a tradition miss out on something that I'm not sure is retrievable. Let me just speak to that first. Because a tradition is much more than outward things that you do. It's more than practices. It's more than certain beliefs. There's something profoundly, I guess I want to say, archetypal. You respond, from a very early age, you're immersed in a way that's beyond the mind. It's beyond concepts. It's this archetypal thing that goes on. You know symbols and what they mean. They speak very profoundly to you. You know certain words, chants, music that has a response that's it's deeper than practice or belief. I don't know quite how to articulate it. And so if you haven't been immersed in that, it takes a long time to get to that place. It takes a very long time. I don't think you have to be in a particular tradition. I think the jury is still out on this because I think this is a very new question, very new situation that we're in. You use that word appetizer platter. I hear that both negatively and very positively. All right, taste the appetizers, see what appeals to you, but you also don't want, the buffet where you can pick and choose, and if you don't like it, you just reject it without coming to terms with it. I think but I like that you used appetizer because I think the metaphor of taste is very important. What is our taste? Where are we drawn? St. Thomas Aquinas said, God draws us according to our natures. So my nature was chivalric. So of course I'm drawn to a kind of a tradition that's going to embody that. What is in us? I don't think it's a matter of going outside ourselves and, okay, try this, try this, try this. I think we have to pay very, very deep attention to what the Bushmen in South Africa call the tappings. We get these, or someone else called signals of transcendence. I think we get messages. Whether we want to use a metaphor, if it's coming from outside or arising from within. But I think we have to listen very, very carefully. And it's not a mental exercise. It's much, much deeper than that. At a certain point, after we do all that, tasting all those appetizers, we're going to know something. Something's going to taste better. It's going to be more nourishing. It's going to feed us on a deep level. And we need to follow that. I think we have to be careful of the smorgasbord approach. But I see value in both. I think people eventually, I want to say, do or will come to a deeper commitment. Because I think endless exploration isn't very nourishing. And if that satisfies us, well, we're missing out on a depth. And I think you can choose one or two. Maybe you can choose three. I don't know. Personally, I don't have any particular practices that aren't my tradition. My way of being interspiritual is to be at home in all of them. So I love sitting in Buddhist meditation in a zendo. I love Well, I love zikr in general, but in particular, there was if you ask me what my favorite prayer is, my favorite prayer is a chanting in Arabic of the 99 names of God from in a particular Sufi lineage, where I used to do zikr with a group in Abiquiu when I took Colorado College students there. That is my favorite prayer. I think the Muslim prayer of prostration, in Catholicism, we only prostrate on Good Friday, and if you're a monk, when you take your vows. Oh, to be able to prostrate daily in prayer, oh my goodness, I think that's the best. So I realize I'm all over the place on that, because I think it's a very hard question, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it. There are people who say you've got to be rooted in a tradition, otherwise it doesn't work. That certainly worked for me. And then out of that, I opened up to all the other traditions. But that's not the case. Too many people are raised without anything. So how do you start? I'm working with this. I think your appetizer platter is a good way to start, but don't stay there because you'll starve. We can't live on appetizers. We need meat, or tofu, but something that's going to really sustain us.
It seems that an important thing that I'm learning from just you speaking is also a kind of middle ground that it seems like you've navigated for your own life, that even though you've been deeply committed to this tradition, you have no problem saying that there are elements of the tradition that you're not aligned with, or aspects of Christian history, that you can't stand behind, and that it's totally okay to wrestle with your tradition. And while not picking and choosing in the sense of just rejecting what you don't like, you do get to live your own manifestation of a specific tradition, you as an individual, but even with like-minded individuals in community. And that seems like such an important question for our day and age, is how do traditions adapt themselves to our current realities? And how, as spiritual practitioners, can we engage with traditions in a non-dogmatic way, but in actually a mutually creative way, where we both allow the tradition to inform us, but we also allow our lived experience and the kind of current cosmology to inform the way we enact the tradition?
Yes, absolutely. I think we have to be self-critical of all of it. I find it weird, for example, that so many people will reject the patriarchy in Christianity, and it is there and it is terrible. But then they become Buddhists and they'll, bow before the guru and put him up on a pedestal, on a podium. It's like, whoa, how did you go from this to that? Don't you see it's the same thing? There's positive and negative, light and dark in all of these traditions. And I think, we have to live in the gray. You're right. It's a middle. It's not black and white. Personally, when I encounter somebody who's struggling with the Christian tradition, I'll say, well, yeah, you can criticize the institution all you want and reject all these negative aspects of the institution, like the patriarchy, like the hierarchy, like the historical attitudes towards women, the Crusades, the Holocaust, all of it. But don't let go of Christ. That's the heart of it. So we have to be self-critical of our own tradition and of the others, and ask the hard questions. And but I have to accept all those negative aspects of my tradition, and I have to take responsibility for it and make sure that I am not perpetuating those traditions, those aspects, those dark aspects. So, are we winding down here, gentlemen? I think we are.
I would love if I've heard that you're a big fan of poetry. So I'm wondering if, to close us out, you have a short poem to share with us. I know we did not give you a heads up to bring a poem, but if
you didn't.
If you have something at the...
Okay.
Ready?
I don't have a poem ready, but maybe I could sing the St. Teresa's bookmark prayer for you, with you. And let me say right off the bat, Teresa has a line, God never changes. And I remember once when I sung this, people went into their heads and said, oh, that's not theologically correct because God does change. And I didn't answer it well at that time. What I want to say is, stay out of your head. This is Teresa's experience of how God's love for her never changes. She's not making a theological statement. She's expressing an existential experience about how God is always there for her. So that's what that part means. And part of what's beautiful about this prayer, it's what's most often quoted about her. And when I first heard it, I thought it meant that the first line is, let nothing disturb you, let nothing dismay you or upset you. And I thought it meant that she was living in this constant state of calm that she had achieved, not being disturbed by anything. And it took years of immersion in her works and realizing, oh no, she prayed this because she was often upset and she was often disturbed. And she prayed it so that she would calm down and be in the eternal presence of God. So here's how it goes. Let nothing disturb you, nothing dismay you. All things are passing, God never changes. Patient endurance attaineth all things. Whom God possesseth, in nothing is wanting. God alone sufficeth. God alone suffice. Or in Spanish, it's a lot more powerful. It's solo Dios basta. God alone is enough. God alone suffices. Solo Dios basta. It's like a battle cry, isn't it? I love it.
Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.